Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Weller and today I want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons. How to find invisible creatures in your Dungeons & Dragons 5e game. The age-old question of how to find invisible monsters, creatures, beasts, non-player characters and characters in your Dungeons & Dragons 5e game is going to be answered today. This is a player and dungeon master guide. This guide is not intended to empower people playing a character into forcing their dungeon master to adjudicate invisibility rules a particular way. Dungeon masters are not assumed by this guide to necessarily be using any particular Dungeons & Dragons 5e invisibility rules or variant rules. Just do what makes sense to you. There is nothing simple about finding invisible creatures, and it has always been that way for Dungeons & Dragons. The topic of stealth, hidden, the hide action, obscurity, and invisibility are complex and situational, and there are dynamic elements to it. This means that rules as written, rules as intended, are impractical for finding invisible creatures, and people will be relying on dungeon masters to make a ruling that makes sense to them and uses the rules as fun. Standard invisibility is not the biggest problem to deal with, but anything that stays invisible while making attacks and casting spells will be for everyone. The invisibility or greater invisibility spell in particular, and these monsters are game changers such as the Drow Mage, the Fairy Dragon, the Invisible Stalker, the Pixie, the Gynosphinx, and the Water Weird. Here is a list of different ways or methods for finding invisible creatures. The Sea Invisibility spell is always the best option and the most successful for everyone. The Gloomstalker Umbral Sight feature can be foiled with the Sea Invisibility spell. The Sea Invisibility spell will not detect an unseen servant, as this is a force, not a creature or an object. Don't rely on an active perception check, a passive perception score, or think that you can know an invisible creature's location with no dice roll, which I have seen floating around in the internet and on the communities. There are a lot of incorrect fictional rule references, quotes, and personal interpretations I find on invisible creatures on the internet. A perception check to notice visual disturbances created by invisible monsters is an action in combat or in a battle, which means it also has a disadvantage as an invisible creature would count as heavily obscured. You're very unlikely to find traces of an invisible creature in a pitched battle with multiple foes, but slightly better in a solo fight when you can focus on one target. The environment requires tracks to be left behind, grass to be parted, leaves, branches, dust, dirt, rain, snow, and other environmental factors need to shift in an obvious way. A perception check to hear an invisible creature moving is an action in battle or combat, with disadvantage, as there is lots of noise from clashing metal, usually in a rowdy battle. That means pinpointing an invisible creature's location is unlikely, and you're probably going to hear absolutely nothing. But quiet environments and solo monsters could give away or give a general idea of the invisible creature's location, as determined by the dungeon master. A perception check to smell an invisible creature is an action in battle with disadvantage, but only creatures with the scent trait are likely to get exact positions correct, and even other creatures will only ever get a general direction correct rather than exact locations. Things like flour, sawdust, or dirt can show up an invisible creature's position if they are stepping on a hard surface or it lands on them. Unfortunately, a bag of flour covers maybe 5 foot in terms of a square, not particularly useful or practical unless everybody has a bag of flour in a confined space. The Detect Magic spell can't find invisible creatures because you need to see the target you are trying to cast the spell on. Dungeon Masters could house rule that Detect Magic gives the general direction of an invisible creature and the School of Magic if you wanted to, which would be Illusion. A rope with a grappling hook connected to it, swung in a 360-degree arc as a character walks, could tangle up an invisible monster. The rest of the party will need to stay clear, and the invisible creature can still drop down prone or crawl to avoid the rope wrapping around them. Swinging a 10-foot pole in a 360-degree arc as the character walks is much the same as the rope and the grappling hook. It should be noted that the pole is not swung hard enough to attack and do damage. Just connect with an invisible creature. Walking through enough spaces or 5-foot squares could make it possible to walk into an invisible monster or creature. This bumping into an invisible monster or creature is surprisingly effective if one character is doing it or creatures have the haste spell cast on them. Attacking a space with a melee weapon will give you disadvantage and is very ineffective unless you already know or have a good idea of the invisible creature's location, or you actually guess correctly. An area effect spell that bombs an area like Fireball and does damage might not detect an invisible creature, but it is much better than guessing its position and not hurting it. Try not to cook your allies with a Fireball spell when using this method, otherwise you're going to be very unpopular and might kill your allies before the invisible monster or character. Cast the Fairy Fire spell when you're pretty sure of the invisible creature's location and you want everybody to see it, but this works much better if you cast the See Invisibility spell first. Creatures with Blind Sight, True Sight, Tremor Sense would have no trouble in finding invisible creatures within their senses range. The Dispel Magic spell can be used to remove the Greater Invisibility spell on a creature. You don't need to see the target, but you must be aware that it is there, so it can't be hidden. That means it can't be unseen and unheard. The Bat Familiar can be used by a caster to see and hear through the bat's echolocation trait, which would be able to pinpoint an invisible creature's location. Throwing ink onto an invisible creature will require knowing the exact location, but will highlight an invisible creature for the whole party. So try to use the improvised attack rules for this situation. The Ranger's blind fighting style that is gained at level 2 allows invisible creatures to be seen 10 foot away, unless they are successfully hidden from the Ranger. The Anti-Magic Field spell temporarily shuts down spells like Greater Invisibility and the Standard Invisibility spell, but not creatures or monsters with invisibility features unless the wording magic is included in the trait or feature. There is only a 10-foot range on the Anti-Magic Field spell, so invisible creatures attacking at range will still be very troublesome. The True Seeing spell gives the target True Seeing, so invisible creatures can be seen. Sage Advice and the Player's Handbook Errata. There is nothing in Sage Advice or the Errata for the Player's Handbook on finding invisible creatures or hiding. Yet people on the internet have quoted Sage Advice or Errata by taking rules out of context, incorrectly quoting them as rules as written. Many aspects of finding invisible creatures are laced with discussions that include personal interpretation. Jeremy Crawford did discuss invisible creatures in a YouTube video on Sage Advice Dragon Talk, but most of what he was saying was taken out of context and not documented in writing. Jeremy Crawford is also biased towards the biggest consumers of Dungeons & Dragons 5e, which are the players of characters wanting invisible monsters to be easy to find without having to use the See Invisibility spell. The only person's opinion that really matters is the Dungeon Master who is running your game at your table when adjudicating the finding of an invisible creature. Spells like Darkness and Fog Cloud are desperate attempts to create cover for invisible creatures' attacks if you can't see them. Sometimes the best tactic is to blind everyone if you can't find an invisible monster or character or creature. Now, if you found this video useful, fantastic. I have a live stream that goes into far more detail if you are interested. If you like my videos, then I have hundreds of videos for players and dungeon masters covering every aspect of Dungeons & Dragons and Dungeons & Dragons 5e. If you want to support the channel so I keep doing video content like this, you can through Patreon, the Amazon affiliate links down in the description, the merchandise shelf underneath all of my videos, or just watch my videos, that's fine too. Make sure to do the usual YouTube things like share, like and subscribe. Hit the bell button to be notified when I go live and when I publish new videos. I go live every week, by the way. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.